Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. And it is a true pleasure to have you with us. And we have an exciting presentation today. So welcome to JFSA's Brain Health and Wellness Initiative series. At JFSA, we bring community education each month to inform and promote a broad landscape for brain health. We offer CEUs to our professional audience as well. Today's topic is remembering names, a challenge for your memory. My name is Jonathan Yassani, and along with my colleague Hannah Doles, we provide care navigation in the JFSA Dementia Care Navigation Program. Our program establishes an empowering environment to help improve the quality of life of those who have dementia or are at risk of developing dementia, while helping family caregivers reduce the stress and burden that often occurs while caregiving. At JFSA, we understand the importance in working with our clients' strengths in applying a person-centered approach to care, which extends throughout our multidisciplinary team of geriatricians, nurses, social workers, and geriatric psychiatrists. Hannah and I meet our clients where they are at and develop individualized care plans that help produce solutions to presenting problems. From linking persons with dementia and their families with community resources to following them with their medical management. We are their point of contact for guidance, as well as an ear for listening, which we take into account when creating interventions that adhere to their biopsychosocial needs and experiences. While presenting, please feel free to address any questions, thoughts, or comments to the Q&A icon. We will take some time after the presentation to answer your questions. Our presenter is Leanne Stewart. Leanne is a registered nurse with an extensive background in health education. She worked as a hospital nurse for 10 years before earning her master's degree in education. She has over 20 years experience in the planning and implementation of adult education programs at Menora Park Center for Senior Living. She has served as their director of the Rose Institute for Lifelong Learning and later became their director of lifelong learning. Ms. Stewart teaches community education classes about the importance of lifelong learning and brain health. She is passionate about educating the community in practical ways they can learn. Sorry if you can hear me, my screen went blank.
Okay, Jonathan, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for my blank screen. So I'm not sure if you can even see me. But Leanne is also, she is our Savvy Caregivers Workshop facilitator, and she is also the facilitator for our support groups at JFSA. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Leanne so we can get started with the presentation.
That's great.
Thanks,
Thank
Leanne.
you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
I hope your screen comes back.
I do too.
Welcome, everyone. So glad that you could all be here with us tonight. And hopefully all of you at home don't have the same screen problem that Jonathan has, so that you'll be able to see my slides for tonight. So again, welcome and glad you could be here. So I know that there's a lot of misinformation out there about memory issues, especially about remembering names. So I think this is a good topic that we can talk about tonight and really see how difficult it is for us to remember names and what's really going on in our brain in order for us to remember people's names well. So I want you all to think about it. Do you have trouble remembering names? Most of us answer yes to that question. There's a big difference though. I was telling Jonathan before the class, younger people around Jonathan's age forget names too. All ages forget names. They don't tend to worry about it as much when you're younger. It's those of us that are getting older, when we forget somebody's name, we kind of panic and think, oh no, am I getting dementia? And am I getting Alzheimer's? Probably not, when we're going to talk about it. But we just panic, and then that makes it even worse, that there's no way we're going to remember that person's name. as we get older, it takes our brain longer to recall information that we have previously learned. So because that recall is slower, it sometimes takes us a lot longer as we get older to remember and to recall somebody's name. But like I said, if we just don't worry about it and take it in stride, we're probably more likely to remember it. But we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So think about what goes on when you meet somebody new. So I know the pandemic has made this a little bit different, and Zoom has certainly made it different because everybody has their name at the bottom of the screen. And so we can cheat. We don't even have to learn people's names on Zoom calls because their name is right there on the screen in front of us. But let's think back pre-pandemic when we would get together in groups or whatever, and we wanted to remember people's names. There's a lot of things going on at the same time while we're trying to remember someone's name when we meet them. We hear their name, we're paying attention to what they look like, we're having a conversation with them. There's probably other conversations going on around us. There's probably other noise and distractions in the room. So focusing in on remembering everybody's name, especially in a crowded space. If you're only meeting one person at a time, it's easy. But if you're in a crowded space, it's very easy to forget people's names because of all of that sensory overload that is going on. So why should we try to remember people's names? Well, first of all, it makes people feel important. I know in all of my professional work, when I worked with groups of people, I worked very hard to remember people's names, and it was appreciated. People always appreciated that I remembered their names when I saw them the next time. And it's not that I was good at it. I just worked very hard to be good at it. But it makes people feel important when you remember their name. It also creates a connection between people. So if you're addressing people by name, it's a much more personal connection, and it's much more polite than ignoring that they even have a name, or hey you, whatever. It's much more personal and much more of a connection to address people by their name. Now, when we start talking about how do you go about remembering people's names, one of the first things I want you to think about is, like anything else that you're going to remember, you need to pay attention. So often, things we think we have forgotten, we never really remembered to begin with. So we never paid enough attention to them so that they were stored in our brain appropriately, so that then we could recall it later. We never really remembered them. And oftentimes this is the case with remembering people's names. We need to pay attention. We're going to talk about this next part a little bit more as we go on and as we practice some things, but we also need to think about using all of our senses. So if we pay attention to how the person looks, if we pay attention to what their voice sounds like, if we think about, do they wear cologne or perfume? Maybe do they have a body odor of some type that is memorable? If you shake their hand, do they have rough, calloused hands? Do they have sweaty hands? Do they have baby soft hands? If we can incorporate all our senses as well as the person's name, it helps form a more lasting memory that we're more likely to remember them when we meet them the next time. Now let's talk briefly about how memories are formed in our brain. So our brain gathers information from all of our senses. So from our eyes, from our ears, from our nose, from our hands, all those things. Our brain gathers that information, and then the hippocampus, which is the red highlighted area on those pictures of the brain, the hippocampus combines all of that information into one memory. But the key to this is it stores it throughout the brain. So let's look at all the places that this could get stored. And we're going to use that same example. So here's the lobes of the brain. No, they're not all these bright colors, but this is so you can tell where the different areas are. But let's think about that example where when we meet somebody, so we see what color hair they have. So that part of the memory would be stored in that green occipital lobe, because that's where color perception takes place. The shape of someone's face is also stored in that same area because that's where our vision is centered. So what we see is stored in that occipital lobe. We hear the sound of their voice. That's stored in that blue temporal lobe. So that's where we hear, and that's where our auditory senses are stored in the brain. The feel of their skin when we shake their hand, that's stored in the yellow, in the parietal lobe, because that's where all our body sensations are processed. And last but not least, if there's an odor associated with the person, positive or negative, that is stored in the frontal lobe, because when smells go into our nose, there's an olfactory bulb behind our nose into our brain in that frontal lobe that processes all those smells. So the hippocampus takes that picture that we see with all that information and spreads it out into different areas of the brain. When we meet that person again, the hippocampus has to go back out and grab all those bits and pieces about that person and pull it back together so that we remember and recognize that person. So it's actually a very complicated process to remember all these aspects of different people that we meet, including their name. So let's look at where we think the actual remembering their name gets stored in our brain. Probably in the frontal lobe. And I didn't actually look that up, but as I'm talking, I'm thinking about it. But that's where our speaking and problem solving and those kinds of things. So I'm guessing that the name, either there or the parietal lobe, is where the actual name is stored. Now, I don't know about you, but I truthfully am much better at remembering faces than I am remembering names. So let's think about that for a minute. Why do we remember faces more than names? Well, believe it or not, there are actually neurons in our brain that are pointed out by the highlighted, those bright green parts down at the bottom of the brain that specifically remember faces. So they've been able to figure this out through scientific study that there are these facial recognition areas of our brain. So our brain is wired to remember faces. The actual name of that area is the fusiform gyrus. Nobody's going to remember that, that's for sure. But it's at the base of those temporal lobes, back here behind our ears, but inside our brain. So our brain is actually wired to remember faces. We have to work harder to remember the names that go with those faces. So the other thing about face recognition is that area of, so on this back page, those green areas at the bottom, they are very close to the amygdala and the hippocampus. The hippocampus, as you remember, we talked about, that's what takes all the sensory information and then sends it out as a memory. The amygdala has to do with emotions. So if you think about that facial recognition area is kind of right underneath where that amygdala is, at the bottom of that temporal lobe. And that's where, if it's someone we know or we love or we feel close to, the amygdala gets involved in that memory because that's where the emotional memories are stored. So again, that's why faces are more important. It also could be a negative emotion. So let's say there's somebody that mistreated us in our life and we're scared of them. And we have a scared emotion tied to that person. Same thing. We will remember their face because it's a stronger memory because it's tied to that amygdala that has those emotional memories associated with it. Now, whenever we put information into our brain as a memory, it has to be encoded. So it has to be stored so that we can pull it back out later for future recall. And our filing system has to make sense. So we need to, and we don't always have control over that. So our hippocampus makes those decisions. But if there are glitches in our filing system, we may have problem remembering somebody or exactly how they look. Or if their appearance changes. So let's say the next time I come back to teach a class, I've dyed my hair bright red. Well, those memories you have of me might be a little different. So there's glitches that can take place in this memory of faces and names. But there are a few good tips and tricks that we can use to help us remember people's names. So the first one that you'll often hear over and over is to repeat the name aloud back to the person. And I know you kind of feel a little bit silly doing this, and you'll recognize it if somebody's doing it to you, but it does work. So if I meet Jonathan for the first time, I say, "Nice to meet you, Jonathan." And then a few minutes later, when I'm still talking to Jonathan, I would repeat it again. So, "Where do you work, Jonathan?" The example on the screen is Diana, that we're going to use the name Diana. And the third suggestion is to associate it for something that makes sense to you or that it's more meaningful. So if you meet someone by the name of Diana, maybe you associate their name with Princess Diana, and then it's easier to remember. Doesn't even mean they have to look like Princess Diana, but just because their name is similar or the same, you make that connection in your brain, and then it is filed in a way that makes more sense that you can pull it back out later. Now, another thing that you can do is you can connect the name to something that has meaning to you. So let's take the example of the pictures of the women on this screen. So let's say Victoria is the person at the top, the first woman at the top, and she's wearing a V-neck blouse. So you put in your head Victoria with a V, Victoria is wearing a V-neck blouse. Now, obviously, I picked these pictures so that I could do this and make this example. You don't always have these same examples when you meet people. And Brooke is wearing a blue jacket. So B for Brooke, blue, B for blue jacket. So you make some kind of a connection. If I met someone whose name was Ryan, I would make a connection because I have a son named Ryan. So that would make me make a connection with them in that way. So anything that you can use to make that person's name have meaning to you in some way, shape, or form, it will help you remember their name later. Now, depending on their name, you maybe can associate a visual image with them. So let's say you meet someone that's called Mrs. Bender. Maybe you picture her bending over and picking flowers. And then you would remember her name is Mrs. Bender. Or Mr. Baldwin. This is kind of silly, but there's this bald little statue who won something. He has that trophy. So you could picture it as Mr. Baldwin. And I know these sound really silly, but if you can come up with some of these things, they are very memorable that you will be able to remember these people's names. Now, we're going to practice. Now, this is hard to do via Zoom. It's a little easier to do in person. but I'm going to show you a series of slides, and it's going to have somebody's name and their picture. And I want you, now I don't want you to take notes. I want you to keep these in your head and pretend you're meeting them in person and you're talking to them. So you can't take notes if you're meeting them in person. And I want you to see if you can come up with one of these tricks to remember their name. And we're going to go through them one at a time. And I'm going to leave them on the screen for a minute or so. And then I'm going to move to the next one. And I think I have 6 people on here. And then I'm going to come up with them all on the screen. And I'm going to have you see if you can remember what everybody's name was. And like I said, I don't want you writing it down. So don't cheat. Try to do it as if you're meeting them in person. So let's practice. So here's our first person, Stephanie. So see what tips and tricks you can maybe use to remember that this is Stephanie. Okay, person number 2 is Robert. Person number 3 is Madeleine. Now let's meet Eric. And now Betty. And last but not least, William. Now, I realize via Zoom, we cannot use all of our senses the way we could if we were meeting them in person. So we pretty much just have looking at them to try to come up with a way to remember their name. So these memories are not going to be stored as well as they would be if we met them in person and had all of these. So if the next time I teach this class and you would come, or the next time I teach a class, you would come back and I would ask you their names, more than likely you're not going to remember any of them because these are kind of meaningless names that you're trying to remember. But just the idea of trying to practice to come up with something to remember their first name is sometimes helpful. So now you can actually write down, if you want to, the next slide. See if you can assign the right name kind of in the general area of these people. I'll give you a minute to jot them all down, if you can remember them. Okay, so now I'll give you the answers and see how you did. Some of you may have gotten quite a few of them right. If you got a bunch of them wrong, don't be surprised because like I said, you didn't get this whole experience of trying to remember people's names by just looking at the picture on the screen. Some of the things that people often could use, however, is, so Stephanie, I might remember because she's wearing a scarf. So I would remember the S's that Stephanie was wearing a scarf. I tried these out on my mom and she said Betty was wearing a babushka was how she remembered Betty's name. So she used that B. I also said that Robert, my father-in-law's name is Robert, and he's always smiling. So that was easy with this guy with the big smile that I could associate the name Robert. And you may have a whole other set of things that you could use to identify these people. Eric looks like quite the jokester with his little finger pointing. So maybe you know somebody by Eric, by the name of Eric, that acts like that, and you might tie their name in. But I want you to think about that when you're meeting new people and see if there's things about their appearance, their name that you can tie together. But in person, you will be much more likely to remember because you can tie in all those other senses, the sound of their voice, the touch of their skin, their smell. All of those things make for a much better memory than just looking at a picture and trying to remember a name. Now, what happens if you're in a situation and you can't remember someone's name? Don't panic or feel bad about it because everybody has trouble remembering names. Another tip that you can sometimes use is to go through the alphabet. So if you go through A, B, think of names that start with those letters, and maybe that will help trigger the name that you can't forget, or that you can't remember, or that you do forget. The biggest thing that I like to tell people is just introduce yourself to that person and admit you should remember who they are, but you can't remember their name, and introduce yourself. One, you've taken the pressure off of them to remember you, because more than likely they don't remember your name either. And you've asked them to tell you their name. So then you can go back to those tricks of repeating it or whatever you need to do to remember what their name is. Again, repeat, repeat, repeat. The more that you can use their name in a sentence, or that you just keep repeating it when you're talking to them, the more likely that you're going to remember it. Use all of your senses. Make sure you remember all of those little intricate details. Maybe you even get scratched by their ring or a bracelet when you're when you're touching their hand. All those things that can add to that sensory experience so that you remember who they are. Remember to connect their name to something that has meaning to you, whether it's the color of their clothing, something that stands out. Maybe they're wearing a shirt that you also have, and that helps you remember it. But anything that you can do to make that visual connection and that visual image to connect it, the more likely it is that you're going to remember their name in the future. Now, you all will get a copy in a PDF form of this PowerPoint, and I've attached links to several resource articles that you can read if you want to get more information. So there's one that has 11 memory hacks to remember names. There's one out of Psychology Today that stresses some of these things. And even though it's from the Alzheimer's Association in Orange County, California, it also has some tips. And most of these I've included in our talk today. But sometimes for those of you that want to remember it a little more, reading it in a paragraph format might be more helpful. So you'll have access to these resources for the class as well. Now, I want to open it up for questions because a lot of times people have a lot of questions about remembering people's names. So please feel free to put your question down in the Q&A or even a comment. If you have a way that you use to remember people's names, please feel free to share that because I like to add other people's suggestions for ways that they remember people's names. But feel free to add those comments or questions down in the chat, and then Jonathan will share them with me. Or not in the chat, in the Q&A.
Thanks,
Sorry.
Well, I'm glad to be back. I know I never really went away, but it was blank for quite some time. So it's nice to be back so I can actually read some questions. Okay. Could you please comment on the role of social anxiety in interfering with our ability to remember the names of people we just met?
Yeah, certainly. Anybody that has anxiety about being in social situations, that is going to impair the ability of you to remember people's names. So stress has a terrible effect on our memory, and anxiety is a form of stress. So if you have trouble in social situations being comfortable, or they give you anxiety or anxious feelings, you've got some stress hormones circulating through your body, and that is going to make it much harder for you to remember people's names. So definitely, if you have any social anxiety issues, it is going to be very difficult for you to remember people's names. And you may only remember people that have something really prominent that you remember, like maybe somebody who has a loud, obnoxious voice. You remember their name because it overrides your stress hormones. But everyday, calm, demeanor people that you meet that don't stand out in the crowd, you probably will have a hard time. So definitely. So if you can work on decreasing your anxiety in those social situations, either by some deep breathing techniques or visualizing kind of calm situations while you're out in that setting, that will help you. But definitely that will make a difference on your memory for sure.
That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I try to find, this is a comment from a viewer. I try to find something unique about their face mask and connect it to their first or last name. I love that.
Yeah, because you know what? Meeting people with a mask on makes it even more difficult. I should have included somebody with a face mask in this presentation. That's a really great idea. I'm going to remember that going forward because you're right. Sometimes people have been really creative with their face masks, and you certainly remember that. A friend of mine has a Ruth Bader Ginsburg mask. So it's a black mask and it has that row of lace right at the top of the mask. And that would be something very distinctive. I've seen a lot of kids that have cute kitty cat masks or puppy masks that have the whiskers and whatnot. So yeah, if somebody has a very unique face mask on, that is a great way to remember people by their face mask. Now, let's go with that. If you meet them another time and they have a different face mask on, it probably is not going to help you. But in a situation where you're trying to remember their name in a short period of time, it will, just like clothing or glasses. So yeah, that is a great suggestion.
I have another suggestion as well. I try to pick out and retain 2 names from history, my choice. If at the beginning of the day I can conjure up these names, others are later reachable. The names I use are Andrei Sakharov and Yelena Boner. These help me reach clarity.
Yeah, there's lots of different memory tricks that we can use to keep our brain and our memory working. And the more we do that across the board with any type of situation, it cross translates. So the more that we work on our memory in general, the more that we're going to be able to remember names and to recall those from our memory. So testing your memory on a regular basis and learning to recall those things quickly, especially as we are aging, that is a great memory strategy, and especially to help increase the ability of remembering names, because the better our memory is in general, the better we'll be able to remember people's names. So that's great to practice with it. I like that idea a lot.
I have never been good at remembering names. Should I even bother trying to do better with it now that I am older?
Yes, you definitely should. Your brain is able to change and learn no matter how old you are. It is never too late to work on making your brain work better for you. Probably in your younger years, you didn't try to use any of these techniques. You just thought, I'll try to remember these people's names, but you didn't know any way to do it well. Even if you're older, even if your brain is working a little bit slower, that doesn't mean you can't still learn new things. So yes, it's never too late. You can still try to incorporate these types of tips and tricks to make remembering people's names easier. Always, never too late.
I have a problem sometimes with names of people that I know well. I remember a lot about them, but not their names.
Yeah, and that's a very common occurrence too. And that's okay, because that is one of those retrieval things. So your filing system is just a little bit off for their particular name. The fact that you remember all these things about them is great, because that means you took all of that other information and filed it away. But that information maybe was more important to you for some reason, that you were making that connection with them, and their actual name didn't get filed as strongly. So I actually think that's a good problem to have. I think I would feel honored if people remembered things about me, even if they couldn't remember my name. So use that as a benefit. Your memory is not failing you. You're remembering all these other things about them. You just didn't file their name away. You maybe didn't repeat it enough times. You didn't make the name connect to those other things about them. So it's basically just a retrieval issue. But the fact that you remember all those other things about them is the signal that your brain is still working well, your memory's still working. It's probably just an age-related change and a storage problem, that you didn't make that name important enough to be able to remember and retrieve later. So you just start working on that. When you know that the name part is what you're having the biggest trouble with, use some of those other things, repeat them, connect it to something, and see if that doesn't help in the future.
You can associate an adjective like elated Elena.
Yes, yes, that's another joyful Jonathan. We can laughing Leanne, whatever you want. Yes, you can definitely put adjectives to describe their personality, their looks. Obviously, if it's a negative one, you don't want to share that out loud. But sometimes those negative things about somebody, if they have distinctive characteristics, can make it easier for you to remember them. You just don't want to say them out loud and hurt anybody's feeling. But yes, that is another great suggestion to help your memory. And funny things. That's the other thing with that amygdala, with that emotional memory center. Sometimes funny things we remember better than plain boring things. So if you can make up some little funny thing about people in your head, that will help you remember their name better as well.
That's really interesting, I think, too. Because I work with clients that have dementia, and I've noticed sometimes they remember something that was emotional that even happened more recently, even though the short-term memory is not so great most of the time.
Yeah,
yeah.
That amygdala really kicks in. I mean, the amygdala is what is really at fault in PTSD, in post-traumatic stress disorder. So the amygdala is overactive, and it's that area of the brain that those really traumatic memories are harbored and that come back over and over. But it's also other emotions too. So very happy memories, funny memories, bizarre memories. So it can work as a good thing and a bad thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was kind of thinking about that, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
When my grandmother got older, she started calling me by my mother's name. I find myself doing this too, to other family members occasionally.
Yeah, this isn't really, an unusual thing that happens. I know, oftentimes I call my kids by the wrong name, or I know my mom called my brother by the dog's name once, or, so it's often those family members' names are all people that we have emotions to. So they could be all more stored together. So it's not unusual for some of those to be interchanged. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because they're all people that person cares for. So you're kind of all in a group that those names go hand in hand. So that's not all that unusual, and it's very common that happens.
I missed one comment earlier. I think the African American lady, was it Melanie, who has curly hair? Madeleine. My daughter has curly hair, and her name is Marilyn.
Ah,
so now, that connection again.
Yeah, and sometimes that might even be confusing for you, because Madeleine and Marilyn are pretty close. So you might even have to, you'd see her and you'd think, oh, that's my daughter, Marilyn. Okay, what was her name? Madeleine. So sometimes if names are similar, it might actually be a little confusing at times, but you're right. If somebody looks like your daughter or their names are similar, those are the perfect ways that you tie that in with whatever their facial features are, curly hair, dark blue glasses, a hat like Jonathan has on. Anything you can do, to tie that in, to make it more meaningful and make that memory more important, you're more likely to remember it. But that's a great idea with the curly hair and making the connection and the close names. Perfect.
And Robert had on a suit, and Robert Hall store used to sell men's suits.
There you go. Perfect way to, yeah. Now,
I
see,
love
I'm not familiar with Robert Hall, but so that would not be one that I would use. But that's how we all have different things that we're going to use that make sense to us. So this is your own personal filing system. It's not somebody else's. So it's whatever makes sense to you is what's important.
Do you find this to be true, like when you're trying to remember like things for school and like how like different subjects or theories and connecting them with similar or meaningful attributes?
I mean, I do a lot of other memory classes, and any time that you can make a connection to something that makes sense, that's why people come up with acronyms, that they use letters to describe something, or anything that you can use to make it make sense or to tie it to something else as a way to remember it. I know when I was in nursing school, and I can't remember what it was, but there was an acronym to remember all of the facial nerves. And it used all the letters, like the first letters of the facial nerves. The one that I always remember and I use a lot is, I always learn to remember the planets by man very early made jars stand up neatly, period. So that you use the first letter, and I probably learned that in 3rd or 4th grade, and I still remember it, and I still use it to remember the planets. So anything that you can do to make sense of whatever type of information that you need to remember, not just names, but anything, any connection to something meaningful or that something that stands out, certainly that is going to make that memory get stored better and make it easy for you to retrieve it later. Definitely.
Is forgetting names a warning sign of dementia?
99% of the time, the answer to that question is no. So if we're forgetting names of people that, you know, we met in social circles and haven't seen them for a while, and we can't remember their name, or we remember all this other stuff about them, no, that is not an issue. If, however, we're forgetting the names of people very close to us that we see all the time, that we interact with all the time, then that could possibly be a warning sign of dementia, but not just run-of-the-mill forgetting. And also, if you recognize them, but just can't remember their name, then that is not a warning sign at all. If somebody doesn't even recognize them, doesn't even know they know them, and doesn't remember their name, that's more of a warning sign of dementia, not just forgetting their name. And oftentimes, I don't know about you, I'll forget somebody's name, and as soon as I leave, I remember their name. And that's a typical response. The pressure's off, I'm not trying to find it, and then it pings into your head and you remember their name. So no, just not being able to remember names is not a sign of dementia. It has to be more of, you know, somebody you interact with all the time, or not recognizing them, or it has to be a lot bigger of a problem than just forgetting a name.
Another comment, ask them how they spell their name. Sometimes I finger spell with American Sign Language alphabet. I am a kinesthetic learner. Writing things down works best. So I can see names printed out. That helps. Do you have more examples of how to ask for their name when they first say your name?
Yeah, you could just say, I'm working on remembering everybody's names. Tell me your name again, and can you spell it for me? Because I do better remembering names if I know how. Be honest with people. Tell them, you remember better. It's funny that you mentioned that you're a kinesthetic learner, because I was just telling Jonathan, my class next month, for this Brain Health and Wellness Initiative is going to talk about learning styles. And being a kinesthetic learner is one of those learning styles. So the fact that you sign out their name by moving your hands with American Sign Language helps you as a kinesthetic learner do it with motion and learner. I am visual, so I picture their written name. So I'm with you. I'd still like to know how they spell their name. I kind of like it when people wear name tags, because then I associate the look of their name on their name tag with the person. If somebody was more of an auditory learner, they would listen to how their name sounds, and that would be a better memory for them. So knowing how we learn is really important to also remember things. And we're going to talk about that next month. So that was a great transition into talking about next month, but that's a perfect way to remember it for you. You know, you need to involve your body moving to remember it. So you picture their name spelled out with the American Sign Language, and that is a perfect way for you to remember it. So great suggestion. Wouldn't work for somebody who's not a kinesthetic learner or somebody who doesn't know sign language, but for you, it sounds like that's the perfect way. And I agree, asking somebody to spell their name, Jonathan and I are two really good examples of that. So my name with the capital A in the middle of it is a little unusual. So if people actually see my name spelled out and associate it with me, they kind of remember it because it's spelled different. Jonathan, even though his name's not on the screen, his is spelled a little bit different with two O's. So that's how I always remember Jonathan, because I remember the two O's. So if they have a unique spelling of their name, then that can be something that you tie in to remember as well. So yeah, having them spell their name can be a way to help you as well. Great suggestion.
Here is, so I think what we were talking about earlier with the planets, my very excellent mother just served us nachos for the planets now.
There you go. Whatever works for you.
And I love nachos. I have a neighbor introduced me to his friend. The friend said, "Oh, my wife always watches the TV show with your name. Do you think this fellow was trying to use a memory trick?"
He might have. He might have been. Maybe just hearing your name triggered that memory, and he remembered that, you know, was it his mother that watched it? It could have been that he was doing it, or it could have just been your name triggered a memory, but more than likely, because he made that association, even if he didn't do it consciously, more than likely, he would be more likely to remember your name another time, because he made that connection to something, even if he didn't do it on purpose, but he might have been. Pay attention to people now, or pay attention to what you do. You may notice other people repeating your name several times, and that's probably the case. They're trying to remember it better. So now you'll be more aware of that.
These are all great suggestions and questions and comments. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Made it a lot of fun.
Yes, thanks so much.
Yeah. So if we did not get to all your questions, please feel free to email them to me, Hannah, or Nicole, and we can get those answered for you. And so you could see our, sorry about that, our contact information's down here. You can email us, give us a call, and we would be happy to get those questions over to Leanne. Also, I wanted to, well, here's Elizabeth O'Toole and Constance Magoulias. Those are both of our doctors, our geriatricians. They work on our team at Jewish Family Service in our Dementia Care Navigation Program. And they help us work with the clients in developing care plans and help provide the best direction and recommendations for each individual's needs. And here is Nicole and Leanne's contact information as well. I did want to let everyone know that there will be a link available to retrieve the presentation in PDF form. We highly encourage all to complete our survey, which you will receive through the email that you registered for this class. If you are wanting CEUs, it is mandatory to complete the surveys. And some additional resources we have our Savvy Caregiver Workshop series that Leanne hosts, our Dementia Support Group, and that's over Zoom, and our Dementia Care Navigation Program that also offers respite and support for our family caregivers, and of course, our Brain Health and Wellness series. I just want to make sure that I covered some questions of great presentation. Thank you, guys. Oh, it's so nice. Thank you. Leanne, you did a great job.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of great comments. Thanks, guys. We really appreciate it. So our next upcoming live webinar is the science behind learning and our brain. And
Ooh, except I didn't change the date.
oh, the date.
That's
Oh,
wrong.
so
that's today's date. So it's September 23rd.
September 23rd. Okay, at 6:30. Yep, like always, 6:30 to 7:30.
Yeah.
And Nicole will send out the information on that. So we hope to see you all here with us again, and hopefully my screen doesn't go blank. But I'm glad it worked out. So I hope everyone has a good evening. Thank you so much, Leanne.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody, for joining.
Yes, thank
See you
you.
next month.
Have a good night.